Hi, everybody. My name is Clayton, and I'm Dimagi's Chief Technology Officer. Over the last couple decades of working in impact technology, I've had the chance to be responsible for data security practices for some small, scrappy teams, all the way up to some teams that were managing data systems with records that covered maybe 1 in 10 people on the planet. And I think best practices for security change so quickly. I always think it's interesting to kind of reflect back on what we've learned and how we've adapted, both because technology changes really fast and because our teams and our responsibilities have really grown in our industry, especially. And I think this topic is of unique importance to us in impact technology, right? I mean, the reason that we're all fundamentally here is to improve lives. And I think digital systems are uniquely able to increase our ability to scale, not just our positive impact, but also the potential harm we can do. By consolidating data, we're increasing its value to bad actors. By making it easier for our key stakeholders to access, we're also making it easier for attackers to get to it. So I think it's incredibly important for us to be mindful of what scales of data we're equipped to handle responsibly, right? Protecting data is really essential for protecting people. And sometimes the only winning move in a security game is not to play. So we need to consider whether the cost of protecting data is sufficiently worth it to, for the impact that we're hoping to generate from it. And one thing I think you might be heartened to know is that regardless of size or budget, almost every organization feels like they're facing challenges having enough resources for security, even if that challenge does happen to be doubly true for our sector, being focused on impact over profit or other goals. But I think being intentional about how to prioritize security is important to be able to leverage our time and our capacity. And to me, these four principles are at the core of an effective approach to being a responsible custodian of sensitive data. And that's being mindful of our footprint, preventing the most common attack vectors, practicing user-centered security, and making sure we're handling data safely. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean in each of these areas and how organizations can incorporate them into their approach. I think the most important starting point for organizations is to really plan structurally for what full breadth of digital infrastructure that they can really be accountable for in an ongoing way. The biggest vulnerability for organizations that have grown from small to large, it isn't necessarily the vulnerability or the security in a new digital system for their new scale. It's often the security of like a legacy system sitting next to it that hasn't been patched in 3 years and after being compromised is just one network hop away. Security is almost always a weakest link problem. In practical evidence-backed terms, these kind of side channel vulnerabilities have been involved in a number of the most significant breaches in our industry specifically. But I think they're also among the most preventable, right? When considering choices for new digital infrastructure, organizations should really be looking to establish not just the base costs, but a holistic cost of what adoption and maintenance of that system is going to take long-term and as it scales up. Because if the personnel and security and capacity required for any maintenance and modernization and monitoring, if they're not considered and kind of spent upfront in like a long-term budget, they're most likely to start arising just when systems start to scale. And I think that's often the hardest time to change course, which is what creates that really, really dangerous situation. And to know what capabilities are important to cover at those costs, it's important to remain focused on the most critical threat models and the current evidence-based best practices for how we mitigate them. Because on a day-to-day basis, most security is still really, really, really boring, right? Almost half of all data breaches, they're still not coming from encryption or hard failures. They're coming from account takeovers. Most system compromises, they're not these esoteric zero-day hacking situations. They're unpatched vulnerabilities that sit on servers for years before some bot finally runs across them when it's looking across the internet for an easy picking. So in deciding what's necessary to control for these risks, it can be intimidating to keep up with what feels maybe like a constantly changing landscape. But knowing more about what works, I think, can reduce the amount of capacity that requires for us to implement it. And I'll give you one example that's based on one of the key resources that our team relies on, which is NIST Security and Privacy Control Schedule that's published by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. To mitigate the account takeover threat model I was talking about earlier, the most recent NIST guidance actively advises against the legacy onerous kind of security theater practices that you might associate with high security environments. Things like rotating passwords every 3 months or insisting that everyone's password has like exactly 2 ampersands and all these really specific things. The evidence-based models say those don't work, right? Based on a review of real world evidence and attacks and what's prevented them, the current guidance is actually just to let users choose their own password and to use correctly configured multi-factor authentication. One thing that's continued to appear over and over in evidence-based practices over time is that underneath all the complexity of digital security, the vast majority of real security failings don't come from some unknown technical failure. They come from human error. So the image that pops into your head here is probably something like phishing, and that's a really, really, really valid concern, and it's only going to get more real over the next, 2 or 3 years. I get fake SMSs from our CEO or a very generous bank that's offering Dimagi a loan or something nearly once a week at this point. Making sure that everyone in your organization is engaged and understanding security risks is more important than ever, as are finding ways that you can make sure that they're really being put into practice. Things like sending fake phishing emails to see whether your team can spot them. But considering human factors effectively in security, it's also about the usability of your security posture. And by that, I mean making sure that people can actually practice the policies that they won't need to, and that they're supported to do so. When I reflect back on all the things that we've done in security as an organization in the last decade, I wouldn't be surprised if the single most effective one was just investing in an enterprise security password manager. Right? Before it was possible for our team to use highly technical tools to safely manage logins, but now it's actually easier for them to use our password manager than it is for them to do anything else. And I think for technical teams, this principle speaks to how important it is to have realistic expectations for what your team can really accomplish and whether you're really prioritizing it as an organization. It's easy to say, that audits are done for all the users with administrative privileges in your system. It's another for a team member to really believe that that's their top priority on a week when there's an unrelated external deadline. Independent security audits like ISO or SOC 2, I think this is why they're so effective and important, keeping teams honest on whether it's actually possible for them to meet their stated security policies and practices, being confident in what it costs to do so. And then, of course, after all that comes the underlying handling of sensitive data, how it can be secured through encryption and safely shared through processes like anonymization. And this is the big part of security that's directly related to the capacities of the tools that you choose to adopt, and not just how you manage them. A lot of digital tools still focus on the really hard controls, advertising like their military grade quantum encryption, stuff like that. But I think it's a really big mistake to make those the biggest factors in decision making. Because to be totally honest, as a tech person, they're really the easiest part of security technology these days. Rather, I think it's more the practical things like, can I safely share sensitive data through this system with someone and be confident that they won't be able to see it after they don't need it anymore? Or can I audit everyone who's added new administrators to our system? Those are the things that are increasingly important as organizations scale and mature, since people can't lose what they don't have. And the nuances of those practical needs highlight a really common challenge across all of these pillars, which is keeping ourselves accountable for how we assess and follow through on them. And I want to hand things over to our Director of Technology, Kai, to talk about the approach and challenges of implementing them at scale with Dimagi's flagship global good, Cowger.
Thank you, Clayton. So we've spent quite a bit of time so far discussing concepts about security, more at the 30,000-foot level. So I want to bring it way down to earth, and I want to talk about what we are doing at Dimagi day in, day out to live up to some of these principles that we've shared in this presentation and give you something to take away and share about other organizations and what they're doing for their security. So I want to start by just talking about our tool. So our open source digital tools are global good. So what that means is that we've built it in a way where it is applicable to different countries, different contexts, to address all sorts of key systemic challenges around the world. The goal is to cut down on fragmentation and duplication of digital tools so that we can accelerate scale and impact across the world. What that means, however, is that the data security and compliance on our team, it's incredibly important to have a wide array of different sorts of certifications and different standards to meet the needs of our partners across the world. So that means HIPAA compliance, GDPR, SOC 2, Privacy Shield. These are all terms that I'm sure many of you on this call have heard one, maybe all of these different frameworks and certifications. And so we've taken an intentional effort to ensure that we meet those needs. And to give you a sense of sort of what that takes at Dimagi, we have to maintain a dedicated team of engineers, engineering managers, and other folks, operations staff, who are watching all of our platform services and looking out for necessary updates and respond immediately to vulnerabilities. So as Clayton discussed earlier, there are those layers of different services that tools like us use, and we have to stay on top of those dependencies and make sure that they're updated. We also have a dedicated team accountable for running reviews of our security controls across the organization. So this is on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next section. And then finally, we perform audits and penetration testing. Some of you on this call may have asked us for that information in the past, and we use an independent third-party firm to ensure we stay up on these certifications. And as Amy shared at the beginning, we are, to our knowledge, the only global good that has a SOC 2 Type 2 certification. So knowing that, I would like to pivot the conversation a little bit and talk about what it was like to receive SOC 2 certification and also what it's like to maintain that certification over time. So SOC 2 is an auditing standard that many of you might be aware of. And it essentially assesses an organization's ability to adhere to trust services criteria around security, availability, confidentiality, privacy of data, and this is across the organization. So essentially, it ensures that a service provider like ours securely manages data to protect the privacy of ourselves at the organization, but also of our partners that we work with. So Dimagi received Type 1 certification in 2021. So 2020 actually was the year we embarked on this long journey to get the Type 1 certification, which essentially shows that you were able to meet the criteria over one full year. And then we received Type 2 certification in 2022, which essentially measures how well you're able to meet the trust services criteria on a recurring basis over time, year after year after year. And so now that we're in 2025, we still maintain that certification. What goes into maintaining this is no small feat. So we have engineers on staff doing the technical implementation. So as you all know, obviously, to maintain SOC 2, there are technical controls, a lot of the things that Clayton touched on around how our software is built to ensure there's no vulnerabilities in place. However, it's the continuous monitoring piece of when new users, when new administrators at Dimagi are added to the platform, when new staff are added to Dimagi as a whole. It's that part that requires a lot of continuous monitoring and checking in terms of roles and permissions. And the good thing, but also the bad thing about cybersecurity is that it continually evolves. So as we learn more and more over time about how to be more secure, it also means that our controls have to change along with them. And these changes have to happen at the human level for it to really matter. And it means our behaviors and our habits have to change. And that's the part that's been the most challenging for organizations attempting to achieve the SOC 2 certification. So this means you have to put people at the center. So this means you have to ensure that your support team is following certain processes around user provisioning, and then you have to make sure we're following up on annual trainings of staff. Those are the types of things where people need to be at the center. And to ensure that we're doing all that we can to prove our strong security stance here, we also undergo the rigorous penetration testing and auditing process that I had spoken about earlier. And this takes place near the end of the year, and it takes place over 4 to 6 months. It's quite a long process to do this with an independent security firm, and it touches wide different ranges from our operations team to our technical staff to our platform as a whole. And during that time, we review all of our controls, dozens of them, and we have to provide evidence for every single one. So if we say we do something in our SOC 2 report, you know that that means we have provided evidence physically showing that we are performing that action over the course of the year. All of this we have found is worth it, despite the time and despite the costs. And it's because this is the way that we live up to our values that we shared here as a company. And as Clayton mentioned, to protect data means to protect the people within our platform.